Liam, we shouldn't... Oh God, please. The words were a broken whisper against his lips, lost between a protest and a prayer. Her breath came in ragged bursts, warm against his skin, each gasp a surrender. Outside, the storm raged, throwing rain against the tall library windows like handfuls of gravel. But in here, the only storm that mattered was the one breaking between them. The air was thick with the scent of old leather-bound books, vintage wine, and her, a dizzying fragrance of jasmine and raw, undeniable want. His hands tangled in the silk of her robe, sliding it from her shoulders, exposing the pale, trembling skin beneath. This was madness, a reckless dive into a fire they both knew would consume everything. There was no thought of his girlfriend Sarah, no thought of her father the governor, no thought of the career he had meticulously built. There was only the here and now, the desperate, frantic press of their bodies on the thick Persian rug before the dying fire, a moment of pure, selfish, destructive bliss that had been brewing for months. It had all started just a few hours earlier, with the relentless drumming of that same rain. Liam O'Connell, the sharpest mind on Governor Thompson's re-election campaign, found himself a prisoner in the gilded cage that was the governor's mansion. The storm had descended upon Albany with a sudden fury, cutting off the roads, leaving him stranded. The governor himself was away, leaving the sprawling, silent mansion under the watch of a skeleton staff and his daughter Alara. She had been a ghost in the periphery of Liam's life for months, a beautiful, sad painting on the wall of her father's political world. He had seen her at press conferences and fundraisers, always poised, always distant, her eyes holding a loneliness that seemed out of place amidst the practiced smiles and empty handshakes. Tonight, however, she was not a ghost. She was real, a quiet, palpable presence in the cavernous silence of the house. The tension that had simmered between them for weeks, through stolen glances across crowded rooms and late-night texts that blurred the line between professional and personal, had now reached its boiling point, trapped and amplified by the confines of the storm. The air crackled with unspoken things, with the dangerous possibility that came with being alone, together, in a house full of secrets. The first time Liam truly saw her, it was not in the soft glow of a ballroom or under the gentle light of the moon in a rose garden. It was under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescence of the campaign's strategy room, a place they informally called the war room. The air in there was always stale, tasting of cold coffee, adrenaline, and the metallic tang of ambition. It was a room of sharp men in sharp suits, their voices clipped and precise, as they dissected polling data and focus group results, carving up the electorate like a patient on an operating table. Liam thrived in that environment, his mind a finely tuned machine, parsing data, anticipating attacks, crafting narratives. He was good at it, brilliant even, and his focus was typically absolute, a laser beam cutting through the noise. But on that Tuesday afternoon, his focus wavered, and his world tilted ever so slightly on its axis. She was sitting in the corner, a silent footnote in a room full of bold headlines. Alara Thompson, the governor's daughter. She was always present at these high-level meetings, a directive from her father who believed it was her duty to understand the family business, the ugly, grinding machinery behind the polished facade of power. She was meant to be an apprentice, but she looked more like a hostage. She held a leather-bound notepad and a pen, but she never wrote anything down. She simply watched, her posture perfect, her expression a carefully constructed mask of neutral interest. She wore a simple, navy blue dress, a garment so conservative and well-tailored that it seemed designed to erase her, to make her blend in with the mahogany paneling of the walls. To everyone else in that room, she was just a piece of the scenery, a symbol of the man they worked for, as inanimate as the state flag standing in the corner. Liam had seen her 100 times before and had registered her in much the same way, a passing thought, a pretty but irrelevant detail. But today was different. Perhaps it was a lull in the conversation or a momentary exhaustion from the endless numbers on the screen, but his gaze drifted from the PowerPoint presentation and landed on her. And he didn't just look, he saw. He saw past the expensive dress and the porcelain stillness. He saw the profound, bone-deep weariness in her dark eyes. It was a sadness that didn't just cloud her expression, but seemed to emanate from her, a quiet, personal grief in a room dedicated to public victory. He saw the faint tension in her jaw, the way her fingers were clamped so tightly around her pen that her knuckles were white. She was not just bored, he realized with a sudden startling clarity. She was suffocating. As if she could feel the weight of his stare, she lifted her head, and her eyes met his across the room. The distance was maybe 20 feet, but in that instant, it collapsed into nothing. The cacophony of political jargon faded into a dull hum. For a single, suspended moment, the masks they both wore disintegrated. He wasn't the ambitious strategist anymore, and she wasn't the political heiress. He was just a man, seeing a woman's profound unhappiness. And she, in her eyes, he saw a flicker of surprise, a startled recognition that someone was looking at her, not as an accessory or a duty, but as a person trapped in a cage. It was a raw, unguarded moment, an accidental intimacy that was more potent than any physical touch. It lasted no more than 3 seconds, but it was enough. She quickly looked away, her gaze dropping back to her empty notepad, a faint blush creeping up her neck. But the connection had been made. A silent, invisible thread spun between them in the sterile air of the war room. The campaign manager's voice droned on, but Liam heard nothing. The data points on the screen swam before his eyes, meaningless squiggles. His mind was replaying those 3 seconds, analyzing the subtle shift in her expression, the depth of the sorrow he'd seen there. It was a mystery, and Liam, a man who solved problems for a living, was suddenly consumed by it. In the days and weeks that followed, that moment became a quiet obsession. The thread of connection, once spun, did not break. Instead, it tugged at him at odd hours, pulling his thoughts away from his work, away from his life, away from Sarah. He started noticing things he'd never seen before. He noticed the way Alara moved through the cavernous halls of the mansion, not with the confident stride of a woman at home, but with the quiet, careful steps of a guest, an outsider in her own life. He noticed that she rarely smiled, and when she did, it never quite reached her eyes. He began to catalog the small details of her existence with an almost forensic intensity. The way she tucked a stray strand of dark, silky hair behind her ear, a gesture that was both elegant and nervous. The scent of her perfume, a light, floral scent of jasmine, and something else, something faintly tragic, that lingered in a room long after she had left. He found himself engineering reasons to be in the same space as her, a detour through the West Wing library where he knew she liked to read, a trip to the kitchen for water when he knew she would be there. He wasn't seeking a conversation, not yet. He was seeking another one of those glances, another one of those unguarded moments where he could see the real person hidden beneath the carefully polished surface. The desire that began to stir within him was not yet physical, not entirely. It was a deeper, more dangerous thing. It was the desire to know, to understand the source of her sadness. It was the craving to be the one person in her gilded, lonely world who saw her, truly saw her. He knew it was a dangerous path. He had a life, a good life, with Sarah, a woman he loved, a future that was bright and meticulously planned. Alara Thompson was a complication he could not afford, a variable that could destabilize his entire equation. But the pull was magnetic, the mystery of the sad girl in the corner more compelling than any political victory he could ever hope to achieve. The first look had been an accident, a random spark. But now, he was actively seeking the flame, knowing full well he was surrounded by gasoline. The second encounter was weeks later, under a sky studded with a million cold, indifferent stars. The mansion's sprawling lawn was a sea of glittering jewels and tailored suits, a carefully orchestrated performance of power and influence. It was the governor's annual summer fundraiser, and Liam was in his element, or at least he was supposed to be. He moved through the crowd with an easy smile, shaking hands with donors, trading pleasantries with journalists, his mind a constant whirl of calculations, remembering names, faces, and the specific political leverage each one represented. But tonight, the performance felt hollow, the practiced smile, a leaden weight on his face. The drone of conversations, the clinking of champagne glasses, the forced, booming laughter, it all felt like a suffocating noise. He was tired of the show, tired of the transactional nature of this world. He needed a moment of silence, a breath of air that wasn't saturated with expensive cologne and veiled promises. Excusing himself, he slipped away from the main tent, past the string quartet, and followed a stone path that led away from the cultivated chaos. He found himself in the governor's private rose garden, a place the public never saw. The air here was different, cool and clean, heavy with the rich, velvety scent of blooming roses. Moonlight filtered through the leaves of ancient oak trees, painting the garden in ethereal shades of silver and deep shadow. It was a sanctuary of quiet, natural beauty, a world away from the artifice of the party just 100 yards away, and that's where he found her. Alara was standing by a marble fountain, the water whispering into a basin, her back to him. She was perfectly still, seemingly lost in thought, a solitary figure in a garden built for two. The moonlight loved her. She was wearing a dress of pale, seafoam green silk that clung to her slender frame, the fabric shimmering like liquid silver as she moved. It was a daring choice compared to her usual conservative attire, and on her, it was breathtaking. The dress was simple, but it revealed the elegant line of her spine, the gentle curve of her hips, the delicate shape of her shoulders. Her dark hair was gathered loosely at the nape of her neck, but a few rebellious strands had escaped, caressing her skin in the soft breeze. Liam stopped, hidden in the shadows of an archway, his breath catching in his throat. He felt like an intruder, a voyeur stumbling upon a private, sacred moment. He should have turned back, but he was rooted to the spot, captivated by the image of her. He must have made a sound, a footfall on the gravel path, because she turned, not with a start, but with a slow, weary grace, as if she were expecting to be disturbed. Her eyes found his in the dim light, and there was no surprise in them, only a quiet resignation. He stepped out of the shadows. "Sorry," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "I didn't mean to interrupt your piece." She offered a small, sad smile. "It's not my piece to be interrupted. It's my father's. I'm just borrowing it." Her voice was low and melodic, with a hint of irony that he was beginning to recognize. He moved to stand beside her at the fountain, keeping a respectful distance, though every instinct screamed at him to close it. "Tired of the show?" he asked. She looked back towards the distant glow of the party tent. "I was born tired of the show, Liam. Some people are born with silver spoons. I was born with a name tag and a set of talking points." The bitterness in her voice was sharp, but it wasn't aimed at him. It was aimed at the world she was forced to inhabit, and in that moment, he felt a powerful kinship with her. "I know the feeling," he admitted, surprising himself with his own honesty. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just directing the traffic in a parade I don't want to be in." This drew a genuine look of curiosity from her. She turned to face him more fully. "You? But you're so good at it. You make it all seem so effortless, so real." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's the job, Alara, selling the illusion. You should know that better than anyone." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound, the gentle splash of the fountain and the distant murmur of the party. He could smell her perfume now, that same intoxicating jasmine scent, but here, mingled with the earthy fragrance of the roses, it was even more potent. "What do you do when you're not this?" he asked, gesturing vaguely towards the mansion. "When you're not the governor's daughter?" She seemed taken aback by the question, as if no one had ever bothered to ask. "I read," she said finally. "Mostly 19th century poetry. They were so wonderfully miserable. It makes my own gilded cage feel less unique." She said it with a wry twist of her lips, a flash of the sharp, cynical wit he'd only ever glimpsed before. He found it utterly captivating. "Miserable but honest," he countered. "Maybe that's what we're all missing back there, a little honesty." And then, it happened. A genuine smile bloomed on her face. It was not the tight, polite smile she wore for the cameras. This one was real, and it was radiant. It lit up her entire face, chasing the shadows from her eyes, revealing a warmth and a beauty that was so stunning it almost hurt to look at. "Maybe you're right, mister." "O'Connell," she said, a playful light dancing in her eyes. "Maybe we should all start quoting Keats at the next press conference. See how the focus groups respond to that." He laughed with her, a real, unforced laugh that felt like a release. And as he looked at her smiling face, bathed in moonlight, a powerful, possessive feeling surged through him. He wanted to be the reason she smiled like that. He wanted to own that smile, to keep it for himself, away from the prying eyes of the world that caused her so much pain. The air between them shifted. The comfortable space of shared cynicism suddenly charged with a different, more dangerous energy. He could see the pulse beating in the delicate hollow of her throat. He wanted to reach out, to trace the line of her jaw with his fingertip, to see if her skin was as soft as it looked. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken words and burgeoning desire, until the sound of her father's amplified voice drifted from the tent, calling her to the stage. The spell was broken. The smile vanished from her face, replaced by the familiar, weary mask. "The show must go on," she murmured, her voice flat. She turned to leave, but hesitated for a second. "Thank you, Liam," she said softly, without looking at him, "for the honesty." And then she was gone, a phantom in green silk, leaving him alone in the garden with the scent of roses and the ghost of her smile, a man standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing he was about to jump. The garden conversation had unlocked something, a door between them that could no longer be closed. The charged silence that had once defined their interactions was now filled with a humming, nervous energy. 2 days after the fundraiser, Liam sat at his desk staring at the screen of his laptop, but the words and numbers were a meaningless blur. His mind was replaying their conversation by the fountain, the sound of her voice, the astonishing, transformative power of her smile. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over her name in his contacts. It was a line he knew he shouldn't cross. Contacting her outside of a strictly professional context was unwise, a foolish risk. He typed a message, deleted it, typed another, more formal one, and deleted that too. Finally, driven by an impulse that felt both reckless and necessary, he wrote, "Hope you survive the rest of the show, and I hope you get to read some wonderfully miserable poetry soon." He hit send before he could second-guess himself again, his heart hammering against his ribs. The reply came almost instantly, a small buzz that felt like an electric shock. "Survival is my specialty," she wrote. "But thank you. The poetry is helping. It's more honest than anyone I spoke to all night, except maybe one person." And so it began, the late-night texts. At first they were innocent, an extension of their conversation in the garden. They talked about books, discovering a shared love for writers who saw the cracks in the world. He recommended novels to her. She sent him lines of poetry that she thought he would understand. It was an intellectual courtship, a meeting of minds that felt safe, contained within the glowing screens of their phones. But the safety was an illusion. Night after night, the conversations deepened, spiraling into a vortex of intimacy that Liam had never experienced before. The screen became a confessional. She would text him late, when the great house was finally silent and her loneliness was most acute. She told him about the crushing weight of her father's expectations, the feeling of being a public utility, a prop to be polished and displayed. She spoke of a past relationship that had been quietly dismantled by her father's political machine because the young man wasn't from the right family. Liam, in turn, found himself opening up to her in a way he never had with anyone, not even Sarah. He confessed his own deepest insecurities, the gnawing fear that his ambition was a hollow pursuit, the feeling of being an imposter among the truly powerful. They were two lonely people, whispering their secrets to each other across the ether, building a fragile, illicit world that belonged only to them. The betrayal began subtly, a small shift in his nightly routine. He and Sarah had a comfortable life together, a life built on shared dreams and easy affection. They would sit on the couch in the evenings, watching a movie, her head resting on his shoulder. But now, Liam's phone was always in his hand, angled just so, away from her line of sight. One evening, as they were watching some forgettable comedy, his phone buzzed. It was Alara. A picture of a page in a book, with a line underlined. "This made me think of you." The message read. A warmth spread through Liam's chest, a secret pleasure that was immediately followed by a cold spike of guilt. Sarah shifted beside him. "Work stuff?" she asked, her voice soft with sleepiness. "Yeah," he lied, the word feeling thick and ugly in his mouth. "Just the team, finalizing tomorrow's press brief." He typed a reply to Alara, his thumbs flying across the screen, his mind a million miles away from the woman curled up beside him. He was physically present in his home, in his relationship, But his soul had been smuggled out, transported through fiber optic cables, to a moonlit garden, to a silent room in the governor's mansion, where another lonely person was waiting for him. The phone became a portal. The small chime of her specific notification tone became the most important sound in his world, a summons he could not ignore. He started staying up later than Sarah, claiming he had work to do, sitting in the dark of their living room, the only light the glow of his screen painting his face. Their text conversations became the last thing he saw before he slept, and the first thing he checked when he woke. The language between them began to change, the platonic lines blurring into something far more dangerous. Innocent compliments became more personal. "I saw you in the West Wing today," he texted one afternoon. "You were wearing a red scarf. It looked good on you." The reply came back, "Thank you. I felt invisible all day, until now." The subtext was a powerful current pulling them closer. One night, after a particularly grueling day, he texted, "I can't shut my brain off." She responded, "What's it thinking about? Honestly?" He typed, his heart racing. "About how I would much rather be talking to you in that garden than sitting here alone." A pause stretched for an eternity before her reply appeared. "Me too, Liam. More than you know." The words hung there on the screen, a confession and an invitation. The emotional affair was no longer a nascent thing. It was a fully formed, living entity, nourished by secrets and thriving in the dark. It had its own language, its own memories, its own pulse. And Liam knew with a terrifying certainty that was equal parts dread and exhilaration that it was only a matter of time before this ghost of a relationship demanded a body. The late-night texting had woven a web of intimacy around them, a secret world invisible to everyone else. But it was a world without substance, made of light and code. The transition from the ethereal to the real happened on a cold, quiet Thursday night. A minor crisis with a budget vote had kept Liam at the mansion long after the governor and the rest of the staff had gone home. He was alone in the governor's private study, a grand, intimidating room filled with dark wood, the ghosts of past political battles, and the faint, lingering scent of cigar smoke. The only sounds were the scratching of his pen on a legal pad and the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, each tick measuring out a second of his stolen secret life. He was exhausted, his mind numb from hours of work, but a part of him felt a low, humming anticipation, a hope so dangerous he barely dared to acknowledge it. He was hoping she would appear. And just after midnight, she did. She entered the study so quietly he almost didn't notice, a ghost in soft gray. She wasn't the poised political daughter or the witty digital confidant. This was a version of Alara he had never seen. She was wearing a simple, charcoal gray cashmere sweater and black leggings that clung to the long, graceful lines of her legs. Her feet were bare, her hair was pulled back into a loose, messy bun, and her face was free of makeup. She looked young, soft, and impossibly vulnerable. In her casual simplicity, she was more beautiful and more real than he had ever seen her before, and the sight of her sent a sharp, painful jolt of desire through him. She held a book in her hand, using it as an excuse. "I couldn't sleep," she murmured, her voice a hush in the silent room. "I saw the light on. I didn't mean to bother you." "You're not a bother," he said, his own voice sounding rough to his ears. "Never." They lapsed into a comfortable silence, the kind of silence they had perfected over text, one that didn't need to be filled. She drifted over to the massive, unlit fireplace, running a hand over the cool marble of the mantelpiece. He watched her every move, the way the soft knit of her sweater draped over the subtle curves of her body, the delicate arch of her bare foot on the antique rug. He noticed then that she was shivering, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor. She wrapped her arms around herself, rubbing her shoulders. "Is it cold in here?" she asked. "Or is it just me?" The old mansion was drafty, and the air conditioning was relentless. "It's cold," he confirmed, seizing the opportunity, his heart beginning to beat a heavy, frantic rhythm. He stood up, shrugging off his suit jacket. The gesture felt monumental, freighted with significance. He walked towards her, the jacket held out in front of him like an offering. "Here," he said, his voice low. She turned to face him, her eyes wide and dark in the dim lamplight. She didn't protest, didn't move away. She simply watched him approach, a silent, waiting stillness about her. He stopped in front of her, so close he could see the faint, feathery pattern of her dark eyelashes, so close he could smell the clean, gentle scent of her shampoo and the warm, living scent of her skin. Time seemed to slow down, the ticking of the clock fading into the background. He carefully draped the jacket over her shoulders, and as he did, the tips of his fingers brushed against the bare skin of her neck, just above the collar of her sweater. It was an accident, a fleeting, incidental contact, but it might as well have been a lightning strike. A shock, white-hot and electric, shot up his arm. Her skin was impossibly soft, warm, and alive beneath his touch. He could feel the delicate pulse beating in her vein, a frantic little bird trapped beneath her skin. His hand froze there for a fraction of a second too long, his fingers resting in the space where her neck met her shoulder. He heard her breath catch, a tiny, sharp intake of air. He lifted his gaze from her skin to her eyes, and what he saw there made his own breath stop. It was a mirror of the shock he felt, a raw, unguarded look of surprise, and a deep, dizzying pool of want. Her lips were slightly parted, and in that moment, the entire world shrank to the few inches of charged air that separated their mouths. He saw everything. He saw the delicate, almost invisible lace trim of a black camisole peeking out from the V-neck of her sweater, a detail so intimate it felt like he was seeing her naked. The desire to lean in, to close that final distance, and taste her lips, was a physical force, a tidal wave of need that threatened to pull him under. It was the hardest thing he had ever done not to kiss her. The moment stretched, taut and fragile, before it finally snapped. She was the one to break it, her gaze dropping as she pulled the lapels of his jacket together, clutching it around herself. The gesture was an acceptance and a dismissal all at once, an acknowledgement of the intimacy and a gentle push back to a safer distance. He let his hand fall away, though he could still feel the phantom heat of her skin burning on his fingertips. He took a step back, putting space between them, the air rushing back into his lungs. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. The physical boundary had been crossed. The polite fiction that they were just friends, that this was just an innocent connection, had been burned away by a single, accidental touch. They had moved beyond the safety of words on a screen. Now, there was this palpable, terrifying, and utterly irresistible current flowing between them. "I should let you get back to work," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She didn't look at him as she turned and walked out of the room, clutching his jacket around her like a shield. Liam stood motionless for a long time after she left, staring at the empty doorway, the ghost of her presence still hanging in the air. The work on his desk was forgotten. The only thing he could feel, the only thing he could think about, was the searing memory of her skin beneath his fingers. Fate, it seems, has a flair for the dramatic. A week after the jacket, a week of stolen glances and charged silences, the sky broke open. A ferocious nor'easter clawed its way down the coast, unleashing a deluge of biblical proportions. Trees fell, power lines snapped, and roads became impassable rivers of churning brown water. And Liam, having stayed late once again to finalize details for a press tour, was trapped. The call to Sarah was a masterpiece of deception, his voice a carefully modulated blend of frustration and regret. "The roads are completely flooded, honey. No, it's not safe to even try. The governor insisted I take a guest room for the night. Yes, of course I love you too." Each word was a small, sharp betrayal, and the guilt was a physical weight in his stomach. But beneath the guilt, a dark, thrilling current of anticipation was rising, a feeling he was ashamed to admit he wouldn't trade for anything. The governor, as fate would have it, was stuck in Washington, D.C. The mansion, a grand and echoing fortress against the storm, belonged to them for the night. After the phone call, he wandered the silent halls, the howling wind outside a fitting soundtrack, to the tempest in his own mind. He found her in the library. Of course, it was the library. It had become their space, the silent witness to their unfolding story. A fire was roaring in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the towering shelves of books. And in the warm, flickering light, Alara was waiting. He knew somehow that she was waiting for him. She wasn't reading. She was sitting on the deep leather Chesterfield sofa, a bottle of vintage red wine and 2 glasses on the table before her. She was wearing a robe. It was a long, sweeping garment of deep sapphire silk, the color of a midnight sky. The firelight played across the fabric, making it shimmer and flow like water as she moved. It was tied loosely at her waist, and as she shifted to look at him, the silk parted slightly, revealing a tantalizing glimpse of a long, pale leg and the delicate black lace of something underneath. The sight was so devastatingly intimate, so far removed from the public figure she was forced to be, that it stole the air from Liam's lungs. This was not the governor's daughter. This was a woman, waiting for a man. "I figured we deserved something better than the coffee from the staff room," she said, her voice a low murmur that was almost lost beneath the sound of the storm. He didn't speak, just walked over and sat down on the sofa, leaving a careful, deliberate space between them. She poured the wine, her movements graceful and sure. The wine was rich and old, tasting of dark berries and secrets. For a while, they just drank, watching the fire, listening to the rain lash against the windows. It was a comfortable silence, but it was charged, humming with the energy of a live wire. Finally, she spoke, her eyes fixed on the flames. "He did it over the phone," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "My father, with Michael. Michael was the ex-boyfriend, the one from before. He never even met him in person. He just had him investigated, decided his family wasn't influential enough, that his chosen career wasn't ambitious enough. He called him and told him that if he ever wanted to have a future in this state, he would walk away from me and never look back. And he did." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, glittering like a diamond in the firelight. "The worst part," she whispered, "is not that Michael left. The worst part is that my father thought he was doing it for my own good. He doesn't see me as a person. He sees me as an asset to be managed, a legacy to be protected." The raw, unvarnished pain in her voice broke through the last of Liam's defenses. He saw in that moment the true depth of her isolation, the profound loneliness of being loved not for who you are, but for what you represent. Without thinking, he found himself confessing his own truths. He spoke of his father, a factory worker who had broken his back so Liam could have a better life, and the crushing weight of that sacrifice. He talked about his own ambition, how it felt less like a noble pursuit and more like a hungry beast he constantly had to feed, how he feared that one day he would wake up and discover he had sacrificed everything that was real for a game that was rigged. He told her things he had never told Sarah, things he had barely admitted to himself. The space between them on the sofa seemed to disappear, a casualty of their shared, whispered vulnerabilities. He was no longer looking at the fire, he was only looking at her. He watched the way her dark hair fell around her face, the way her lips, stained red from the wine, parted when she listened. The silk of her robe seemed to be breathing with her, rising and falling, and the image of the black lace beneath it was burned into his mind. The storm outside was a distant, muffled roar. The only storm that mattered now was here, in this room, in the charged space between their bodies. The conversation eventually died, the confessions hanging in the air, having done their work. There was nothing left to say. They simply looked at each other, the firelight dancing in their eyes. He saw his own desperate longing reflected back at him. This was the point of no return. This was the moment that had been building since that first glance in the war room. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers grazed the soft skin of her temple, a conscious, intentional touch, a question. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his hand, her eyes fluttering shut for a brief second, a silent, complete surrender. He let his hand cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. She was trembling slightly, or maybe he was. The storm within had finally matched the storm without, and it was about to break. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her mouth, and he knew that he was about to shatter his entire world for the taste of her lips, and he didn't care. His mouth met hers, and it was not a gentle exploration, but a desperate, hungry collision. It was a kiss that tasted of vintage wine, pent-up longing, and the metallic tang of a decision finally made. For a breathless moment, she responded with equal fire, her hands coming up to clutch his shirt, pulling him closer as if she were afraid he might vanish. It was a kiss of starvation, a frantic attempt to consume the months of stolen glances, secret texts, and unspoken desires in a single, searing moment. But then, just as quickly, she pulled back, her eyes wide with a dawning panic, the reality of their situation crashing down upon her. Liam, no, she breathed, her voice trembling as she pushed lightly against his chest. We can't. Your girlfriend, Sarah, my father. Her words were a frantic litany of their obligations, a list of all the reasons this was a catastrophic, world-shattering mistake. He looked into her terrified eyes, his own heart hammering against his ribs. He knew she was right. Every word was a nail in the coffin of his respectable life. But the sight of her, bathed in firelight, her lips swollen from his kiss, the sapphire silk of her robe gaping open, had pushed him far beyond the reach of reason. He silenced her protest with a gentle finger to her lips. I know, he whispered, his voice thick with a sincerity that frightened him. I know all of it. But it's all outside this room. The storm, the world, everything. It can't get in tonight. Just for tonight, Alara. Let it be just us. Let me be with you. His words were a plea and a permission slip all in one. He saw the conflict warring in her eyes, the fight between conscience and a loneliness so profound it ached. And then he saw her surrender. It was a subtle thing, a slight softening of her jaw, a slow exhale of breath she seemed to have been holding forever. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the answer he needed. His hands, which had been resting on her waist, moved with a newfound purpose to the silk tie of her robe. His fingers fumbled for a moment, clumsy with need, before the knot gave way. He slowly pushed the robe from her shoulders. The sapphire silk whispered as it slid down her arms and pooled at her bare feet, a puddle of midnight on the rich colors of the Persian rug. And then she was standing before him, clad only in a delicate creation of black lace and shadows. A simple bra and matching panties that did more to highlight her nakedness than to conceal it. The firelight kissed her skin, turning it to warm ivory, tracing the gentle curve of her hips, the flat plane of her stomach, the swell of her breasts. She was a masterpiece of soft lines and pale skin against the dark lace, and the sight of her was the most beautiful, terrifying thing he had ever seen. Alara, he breathed, the name a prayer on his lips. God, you are so beautiful. He knelt before her, his hands finding her hips, and pressed his face against her stomach, inhaling her scent, that intoxicating mix of jasmine and warm, clean skin. He felt a tremor run through her, as his lips began their exploration, tracing a path of fire up her skin, over her ribs, to the valley between her breasts. Her initial, tense resistance melted away, her hands leaving his shoulders to tangle in his hair, her head falling back with a soft sigh. He lifted her effortlessly and carried her the few feet to the center of the rug, laying her down gently before the hearth. The wool was soft and warm against her bare back. He came down over her, their bodies finally pressing together, skin to skin, the rough texture of his clothes a stark contrast to her softness. The kiss this time was deeper, slower, a prelude to the storm that was coming. His hands and mouth were everywhere, learning the geography of her body, discovering the places that made her gasp his name. Her protests were long forgotten, replaced by a language of pure sensation. Her quiet sighs became breathy whimpers, and her whimpers became low, throaty moans that vibrated against his lips. The sounds she made were of pure, unadulterated pleasure. The sounds of a woman who had been starved of touch, of affection, of being truly wanted. Liam, please, she gasped, the words a plea for him to stop and a desperate command for him to never, ever stop. He moved between her legs, the firelight casting their entangled bodies in a primal, flickering dance of shadows on the library walls. The world outside ceased to exist. There was no storm, no governor, no Sarah. There was only the heat of the fire, the smell of old books, the taste of her skin, and the overwhelming, all-consuming reality of their bodies finally joined together. It was not gentle. It was a frantic, desperate act, a dam of suppression breaking under the immense pressure of their shared secrets and forbidden desires. It was clumsy and raw and perfect. He watched her face, her eyes squeezed shut, her lips parted as a long, keening moan was torn from her throat. "Oh, Liam," she cried out, her voice breaking on his name. "Right there. Don't stop." And he didn't stop, he couldn't stop, he was lost in her, in the rhythm they created together, a wild, frantic pace that mirrored the beating of his own heart, pushing them both closer and closer to the edge, until finally, with a shared cry, They fell over it together, shattering into a million pieces in the firelight. The fire, once a roaring accomplice to their passion, had died down to a bed of sullen, glowing embers. A chill began to creep into the vast library, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was the chill of reality, seeping back in under the door, through the cracks in the window frames. Liam lay on the Persian rug, the scratchy wool a strange contrast to the memory of Alara's soft skin. She was asleep, or pretending to be, her body curled into his, her breathing slow and even. In the dying light of the fire, she looked peaceful, almost innocent, a fallen angel in a sea of tangled silks and discarded clothing. But as the adrenaline and desire ebbed away, a different feeling began to wash over him, a cold, sickening tide of regret. He gently extricated himself from her arms, his movements slow and careful, as if trying not to wake a sleeping predator. He stood up, his own nakedness feeling clumsy and shameful in the growing silence. He found his clothes and began to dress, the familiar act of pulling on his shirt and trousers feeling alien, a costume for a man he no longer was. The first hint of dawn was a cruel gray smear against the tall, arched windows. It was a sterile, unforgiving light, nothing like the warm, conspiratorial glow of the fire. It crept across the floor, touching the overturned wine glasses, the rumpled rug, and finally, her sleeping form. In this new light, their passion seemed less like a fated, elemental event, and more like what it was, a sordid, desperate act committed in the shadows. And as he looked at her, his mind, unbidden, conjured an image of Sarah. He saw her face, so open and full of trust. He heard her voice on the phone, her easy, loving, "I love you too." He thought of their small apartment, the life they were building, a life of shared jokes, comfortable silences, and unquestioned fidelity. Every mundane, beautiful detail of that life now felt like a separate accusation, a piece of evidence in the trial of his own character. He wasn't the man Sarah loved, not anymore. That man wouldn't have done this. A wave of self-loathing so powerful it made him feel physically ill washed over him. He was a monster, a common, garden-variety cheat, hiding his weakness behind a flimsy excuse of a rainstorm. Alara stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at him, standing there fully dressed, and a flicker of something fear, disappointment, understanding passed across her face. The magical, intimate connection of the night was gone, replaced by the stark, uncomfortable reality of the morning after. She sat up, pulling the sapphire robe around her, covering her nakedness as if they were strangers. The silence between them was immense, a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was filled with everything they couldn't say. What now? What does this mean? Was this a mistake? They both knew the answers, and they were too cowardly to speak them aloud. This wasn't the beginning of something. It was the wreckage of something. The act of dressing became a slow, awkward ritual of separation, of re-erecting the walls that had so spectacularly crumbled just hours before. He found her lace panties near the sofa and handed them to her, avoiding her eyes. She took them without a word. They were no longer lovers. They were co-conspirators, tidying up the scene of the crime before the world woke up. "The storm has passed," he said finally, his voice sounding like a stranger's. "The roads should be clear." It was a statement of fact, but it felt like a closing argument. "You should go," she said, her voice small and flat. She wouldn't look at him. She was staring into the cold ashes of the fireplace. There were no tender goodbyes, no lingering kisses. He couldn't get out of that house, out of that room fast enough. As he walked towards the door, he felt a profound sense of loss, not just for the life he was about to poison, but for the brief, intense connection that had just been extinguished. A connection so powerful it had burned his entire world down. He paused at the door and looked back. She was still sitting by the fireplace, a small, lonely figure in a vast, opulent room, clutching his jacket from the other night around her shoulders. The drive home was a journey through a washed-out, broken world. Fallen branches and debris littered the streets, the scars of the storm. Liam drove on autopilot, his mind a chaotic mess of guilt, justification, and fear. He was constructing the lie, shoring up its defenses, preparing the story he would tell Sarah about a sleepless night spent on a guest room couch. But the lie felt thin and brittle, incapable of holding the immense weight of his transgression. He finally reached their apartment building, the place he called home. But as he walked down the familiar hallway, it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a stage, and he was an actor who had forgotten his lines. He let himself in as quietly as possible. The apartment was warm and smelled of coffee and Sarah. On the kitchen counter was a note. Hope the storm wasn't too bad. Left coffee for you. See you tonight. I love you. The simple, innocent words were like a physical blow. He walked into their bedroom. Sarah was sleeping, her face relaxed and peaceful in the morning light. One arm flung across his side of the bed, in the space where he was supposed to be. And the guilt, which had been a heavy weight, now became a living thing, a cancerous growth in his chest. The lie was no longer just a story he had to tell. It was a poison he had to swallow, a new identity he had to wear. He stood in the doorway, a stranger in his own life, looking at the woman he had so thoroughly betrayed. The man she loved was a ghost, left behind in a grand library, his ashes mingled with the embers of a dying fire. And this new man, this hollow thing standing in his place, knew he would have to spend the rest of his life pretending to be him. For 10 excruciating days, they were ghosts to each other. They moved through the grand halls of the mansion like magnets turned to their opposing poles, repelling each other with a force as powerful as the one that had once drawn them together. If he entered a room, she would find a reason to leave. If their paths were about to cross in a hallway, one of them would abruptly turn, studying a painting or ducking into an office. The silence between them was no longer intimate. It was a screaming void, filled with the memory of the firelight and the suffocating weight of his guilt. Liam threw himself into his work with a punishing ferocity, hoping to exorcise her from his mind. He went home to Sarah and tried to be the man he was supposed to be, the man he once was. He listened to her stories about work, he helped her with dinner, he held her at night, but it was all a hollow performance. His body was there, but his soul was back in that library, and his skin still burned with the phantom touch of a woman he was desperately trying to forget. But memory is a stubborn, insidious thing. The craving was a physical ache, a gnawing hunger that his quiet, comfortable life with Sarah could not satisfy. The guilt was real, a constant low-grade fever, but the addiction was stronger. He was a man dying of thirst, and he had tasted the only water that could quench it. The relapse was not a slow slide, it was a fall from a great height. It happened during a bustling evening reception for the press corps. The mansion was alive with the flash of cameras, the murmur of 100 conversations, and the sharp, predatory energy of journalists on the hunt. Liam was in his element, deftly handling questions, spinning narratives, projecting an aura of calm control. And then he saw her. She was standing across the ballroom, talking to an elderly senator, wearing a simple, sleeveless black dress that left her pale shoulders bare. She looked elegant, untouchable, and utterly miserable. Their eyes met over the heads of the crowd, and in that single, silent exchange, the fragile truce they had maintained for 10 days was shattered. It wasn't a look of love or even affection. It was a look of pure, unadulterated recognition, a shared, desperate acknowledgement of their mutual sickness. He saw his own ravenous hunger reflected in her eyes. There was no need for words. She gave a barely perceptible nod, her gaze flickering for a fraction of a second towards the hallway leading to the mansion's seldom-used east wing. Then she excused herself from the senator and disappeared into the crowd. Liam's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and exhilaration. He waited for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute, his mind racing. This was insane. This was reckless. It was a career-ending, life-destroying risk, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that he was going to take it. He mumbled an excuse to the reporter he was talking to and followed her path, his body moving on an instinct that had nothing to do with self-preservation. He found her in a small, dusty records room, a place filled with filing cabinets and the faint, dry smell of aging paper and forgotten history. The door had an old-fashioned lock, and the moment he slipped inside, she turned the key, the heavy thunk of the bolt sounding like a death knell and a starting pistol all at once. The muffled sounds of the party outside seemed a world away. In here, there was only the dim light from a single grimy window and the frantic, ragged sound of their breathing. There was no hesitation this time, no confession, no gentle seduction. The moment the lock clicked, he was on her, pressing her back against the cold, solid wood of the door, his mouth crashing down on hers. The kiss was not a reunion, it was a collision. It was bruising, demanding, and utterly devoid of tenderness. It was the kiss of two addicts finally getting their fix. His hands were frantic, tangling in her hair, pulling her face closer to his as his body pinned her against the door. "Tell me you missed this, Alara," he growled against her lips, the words a guttural demand for validation, for proof that he wasn't the only one who had been suffering. She responded not with words but with a desperate, animal whimper, her fingers digging into the fabric of his suit jacket. His hands roamed her body, rediscovering her through the fine wool of her dress. He found the hem and slid his hand up the warm, smooth skin of her thigh, a jolt of pure electricity shooting through him. He reached the apex of her legs, his fingers finding the delicate barrier of her silk and lace panties. Without breaking the kiss, he hooked his fingers in the fabric and impatiently pushed it to the side. Her breath hitched, a sharp gasp against his mouth. Every second, she finally choked out, her voice a raw, broken whisper. "God, Liam, harder." It was all the encouragement he needed. This was not the slow, almost worshipful act in the library. This was raw, primal, and stripped of all pretense. It was a frantic, vertical dance against the door, driven by a desperate need to reclaim the feeling they had lost, to feel that intense, obliterating connection again, if only for a few stolen minutes. The sounds of the reception outside a distant laugh, the bass line of the music were a thrilling, terrifying counterpoint to her soft moans and the rasp of their clothes. It was sordid and reckless and more intoxicating than any wine. He was consumed by the feel of her, the scent of her, the taste of her, a man drowning in a sensory overload he had willingly dived into. This was no longer about love or escape. It was about possession, about marking his territory on the one thing in his life that felt real, even if it was a beautiful, destructive lie. The affair, once a secret garden, had become a minefield. The reckless high of their second encounter in the dusty records room had curdled into a constant, low-grade paranoia. The thrill was no longer in the pleasure itself, but in the terrifying, razor-thin margin of not getting caught. Their trysts became less frequent but more frantic, driven not by a desire for intimacy but by a grim, compulsive need. They were no longer stealing moments of connection. They were feeding an addiction, and the hunger was making them careless. The mansion, once their private playground, now felt like a prison yard, with security cameras for guards and every staff member a potential witness. A shared look across a crowded room was now fraught with peril. A brushed hand in a hallway felt as loud as a gunshot. The lies to Sarah had become a second language for Liam, a dialect of deceit he was now fluent in. But the fluency came at a cost. He was losing weight. He jumped every time his phone rang. He was a tightly wound spring of anxiety, and the constant tension was beginning to show. Alara, too, was fraying at the edges. She vacillated wildly between a clinging, desperate possessiveness and a cold, self-loathing withdrawal. Some nights she would bombard him with texts, needing reassurance, needing to know he was thinking of her. Other nights, she would be silent, and he would be left to wonder if she had finally come to her senses, a thought that filled him with both terror and a strange, unwelcome sense of relief. The near miss, when it came, was as brutal and efficient as an executioner's blade. They had grown bolder, convincing themselves that the upper floors of the mansion's residential wing were safe after the family had retired for the night. They found a small, unused sitting room, a sewing room from a bygone era, with a chaise lounge and windows that overlooked the darkened city. It felt insulated, forgotten, a pocket of safety in the vast, dangerous house. For a few minutes, they managed to reclaim a shadow of their first night together. The passion was desperate, a frantic attempt to outrun the fear that was always nipping at their heels. They were a tangle of limbs on the chaise lounge, his suit jacket and her silk blouse discarded on the floor, their mouths locked in a bruising kiss that was more about silencing their anxieties than expressing affection. And in the middle of it all, they heard it. Footsteps. Not the distant, muffled steps of a guard on a lower floor, but close, purposeful footsteps in the hallway right outside their door, followed by voices. One was the governor's chief of staff, a man with the cheerful demeanor of a shark. The other was the head of the mansion's security detail. Ice. Sharp and absolute, flooded Liam's veins. They froze, every muscle locked, their bodies still intimately entwined. In Alara's wide, terrified eyes, he saw his own panic reflected back at him, a silent, shared scream. The voices were clearer now, directly outside the door. And the governor was insistent that we double-check the window locks on this entire floor, the chief of staff was saying. He read some report about second-story break-ins. The doorknob began to jiggle. It was a sound more terrifying than a thunderclap. A frantic, silent scramble ensued. It was a clumsy, horrifying ballet of shame and fear. Liam rolling off her, pulling his trousers up, his hands shaking so badly he could barely manage the button. Alara snatching her blouse from the floor, trying to push her arms through the sleeves, her face a pale mask of pure terror. They were animals in a trap, listening to the metallic rattle of the old lock. "It seems to be locked from the inside," the security guard said. His voice, a dispassionate baritone that sent a fresh wave of nausea through Liam. "That's odd," the chief of staff replied, his voice laced with suspicion. "This room hasn't been used in years." Liam's entire life, his career, his relationship with Sarah, the governor's political future, it all flashed before his eyes, a slideshow of impending ruin. He looked at Alara, who was pressed against the far wall, holding her breath, her hand over her mouth as if to physically stifle a scream. This was it. This was the end. The ticking time bomb had finally run out of seconds. And then, a miracle, or perhaps just a crueler twist of fate, a radio crackled to life on the security guard's belt. "We have a situation at the front gate," a tinny voice announced. "Priority call." There was a pause. Liam could hear the chief of staff let out an impatient sigh. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with annoyance. "Forget the windows for now. Let's go." The footsteps receded down the hall, leaving behind a silence that was more deafening than the panic that had preceded it. For a full minute, neither of them moved, neither of them breathed. They just stood there, two statues of shame in a dusty, forgotten room. The adrenaline drained away, leaving them hollowed out and trembling. The thrill was gone. The passion was gone. All that remained was the cold, stark, undeniable reality of how close they had just come to absolute obliteration. He couldn't even look at her. He fumbled for his jacket, his hands still shaking. "I have to go," he whispered, the words sounding pathetic and small. She just nodded, her eyes vacant, staring at the door that had almost been their undoing. They left the room separately, without another word or a backward glance, two survivors slinking away from a wreckage they themselves had caused. As he was making his way down a back staircase, his heart still trying to beat its way out of his chest, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out. The screen glowed with a picture of Sarah, smiling. He almost declined the call, his thumb hovering over the red button, but he knew that would only create more questions. He took a deep, shuddering breath and answered, forcing a calmness into his voice that he did not feel. "Hey, you," he said. "Hey, stranger." Sarah's voice was warm and cheerful, a sound from another universe, a universe of normalcy and love that he had just torched. "I was just lying here thinking about you. Are you going to be much later?" He leaned his head against the cold plaster of the wall, closing his eyes. Soon, he lied, the word tasting like ash. "Just wrapping up. A few last-minute things." "Well, hurry home," she said, her voice dropping to a soft, intimate murmur. "I miss you." And with those three simple, honest words, the last of his composure cracked. The lie was no longer a tool he could control. It was a cancer, and it was eating him alive from the inside out. The affair was no longer a secret escape. It was a waking nightmare. He could hear the bomb ticking again, louder this time, in the frantic pulse behind his eyes, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was only a matter of time before it finally went off. The near miss in the sewing room had been a bucket of ice water to the face, shocking them out of their reckless fever. The affair didn't end, not immediately. Instead, it entered a state of morbid paralysis. The fear had finally eclipsed the desire. They were no longer two people stealing moments of passion, but two fugitives, constantly looking over their shoulders, bound together by a shared, toxic secret. The silence between them returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a shared trauma, the silence of two people who had stared into the abyss and seen their own ruin reflected back. Liam felt as though he were living with a ghost, the ghost of the man he used to be. He walked and talked and worked, but inside he was hollowed out, eaten away by the constant corrosive acid of his lies. The pressure was becoming unbearable, and the cracks were beginning to show. Sarah saw them. She was not a fool. She saw the way his eyes were always tired, shadowed by a sleeplessness that had nothing to do with work. She saw the way he flinched at the sound of his own phone, the way his smiles became brittle, fleeting things that never reached his eyes. One evening, as they were washing dishes, her hands in the warm, soapy water next to his, she stopped and looked at him, her expression one of deep, gentle concern. "Liam," she said, her voice so soft it was almost an apology. "Is everything okay? You seem so far away lately, like you're here, but you're not. Is it the campaign?" Her kindness was a blade twisting in his gut. He wanted to confess, to vomit out the entire sordid story and beg for an absolution he knew he didn't deserve. Instead, he manufactured a weak smile and lied again. "It's just the pressure," he said, the words feeling like sandpaper in his throat. "The final push. It'll be over soon." She accepted his answer, but he saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes, a tiny fracture in the foundation of her trust that he knew would soon become a chasm. He was losing her, not in a dramatic confrontation, but slowly, quietly, lie by lie. The final summons came on the night before the election, the final, frantic 24 hours of the campaign. His phone buzzed with a text from Alara. It didn't have the flirtatious energy of their early messages or the desperate need of their more recent ones. It was stark, simple, and absolute. "I need to see you. Tonight. The library. Please." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a plea from someone at the end of their rope. Liam knew, with a certainty that felt like a block of ice in his stomach, that this would be the last time. His walk through the quiet, sleeping mansion felt like a condemned man's final journey. He didn't feel desire, only a profound, bone-deep sadness and a sense of grim finality. He found her standing by the tall windows, looking out at the lights of the city. There was no fire in the hearth tonight. The room was cold and filled with shadows, a perfect mausoleum for their dead affair. She turned as he entered, and in the dim light, he could see the devastating toll the last few weeks had taken. She looked fragile, exhausted, her beauty dimmed by a sorrow that seemed to have settled deep within her. They didn't rush into each other's arms. They stood apart, the space between them an ocean of regret. "It's over tomorrow," he said, stating the obvious. "The campaign. Is it?" she asked, her voice a near whisper. "Will it ever be over for us, Liam?" Her eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "I can't live like this anymore. The fear, it's in everything. It's in the way I breathe." She finally looked at him, her gaze raw and pleading. "I wish I had met you differently, Liam. I wish I had met you in another life, a life where we were just two people, with no titles and no one else to hurt." The words were a perfect echo of the lament in his own soul. "Me too, Alara," he said, his voice cracking. "God, me too." It was a confession of their shared tragedy, a final acknowledgement that they were the right people in the wrongest of all possible worlds. She closed the distance between them then, and her kiss was not passionate, but desperate and unbearably sad. He could taste the salt of her tears on her lips, a final, bitter communion. Their final encounter was not an act of lust. It was a ritual of grief. It was slow, tender, and shadowed by the crushing weight of their imminent ending. Every touch was a farewell. His hands moved over her body, not with frantic need, but with a mournful reverence, as if trying to memorize every curve, every line, every inch of her skin for the long, empty years he knew were ahead. They made love on the cold floor, in the heart of the room where their destruction had so passionately begun. There were no cries of pleasure, only the soft, broken sounds of two people clinging to each other as their world fell apart. It was a dance of ghosts, a desperate, final attempt to find some meaning, some beauty in the wreckage they had made, but there was none. There was only the profound, aching sadness of what could never be. As they lay together in the aftermath, entangled in the shadows, there was no comfort, no sated satisfaction. There was only a cold, shared certainty. It was over. It had to be. They dressed in silence, the simple act of putting on their clothes, a final symbolic separation. They were no longer co-conspirators. They were just two broken, solitary people, and the unraveling was finally, mercifully, complete. All that was left was to face the fallout, alone. The governor won the election in a landslide. The victory party at the mansion was a deafening symphony of celebration, a roaring testament to the success of Liam's strategies. Champagne flowed, confetti fell, and the air was thick with the triumphant, intoxicating smell of power. But for Liam, it felt like a funeral. Amidst the chaos, he found Alara near the same rose garden where they had shared their first real conversation. The space that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a gravesite. They didn't need to say much. Their final night in the library had said it all. "It's over," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I know," she replied, her gaze fixed on some distant point in the darkness. "Goodbye, Liam. Goodbye, Alara." And that was it. No tears, no final, desperate kiss. Just the quiet, clean amputation of a limb that had become septic. He watched her walk back toward the glittering lights of the party, back to her role, her face a perfect porcelain mask. 2 days later, Liam went home and shattered his own life. He sat Sarah down in the living room of the apartment they had built together, and he confessed. He didn't make excuses or try to soften the blow. He simply laid out the ugly, brutal truth of his betrayal, word by painful word. He watched as the trust in her eyes died, replaced by a dawning horror, then a deep, cavernous wound. The silence that followed his confession was the loudest sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of their future breaking, of their shared memories turning to ash. Their relationship didn't end in a storm of shouting. It ended with a quiet, devastating finality, a death as quiet and absolute as the one his affair had just suffered. The next day, he walked into the chief of staff's office and resigned, citing burnout and the need for a change of pace. It was a clean, professional exit. No one would ever know the real reason he was walking away from the most promising political career of his generation. As he left the mansion for the last time, he didn't look back. The grand, imposing building was no longer a symbol of his ambition. It was a monument to his failure, a tombstone for a part of himself he had killed within its walls. Years passed, as they always do. Liam moved to a different city, taking a quiet, unassuming job in corporate communications, a world away from the high-stakes game of politics. He lived a life of quiet penance, the sharp edges of his ambition worn smooth by the relentless tide of his regret. He never saw Alara in person again, but sometimes he would see her in the news. He saw her standing by her father's side, as always. He saw the announcement of her engagement to a blandly handsome man from a family with the right political connections. She was the perfect political princess, poised and smiling for the cameras, but Liam could see what others couldn't. He looked past the smile and saw the same profound, deep-set loneliness in her eyes, a haunted quality that he knew he had helped put there. He could never be sure if she was stronger for what they had done, or if she was simply more broken, her cage more elegantly decorated, but a cage nonetheless. He hoped, for her sake, it was the former. Sometimes, on nights when it rains, he finds himself in a quiet, anonymous bar, staring into a glass of whiskey. The sound of the rain against the window is a trigger, a key that unlocks the door to the library, to the feel of her skin in the firelight, to the taste of her tears on his lips. And in those moments, he lets himself wonder, was it love? Or was it just a desperate, selfish attempt by two profoundly lonely people to feel something real, even for a moment? Was the brief, blinding incandescence of their connection worth the permanent darkness that followed? The questions hang in the air, unanswered, because he knows the answer is too painful to confront. He knows that what they had was not a grand, tragic romance, but a fever, a beautiful, destructive illness that burned through their lives, leaving nothing but scar tissue behind. He takes a sip of his whiskey, the burn in his throat, a familiar, welcome pain. He closes his eyes and sees the mansion, not as a building of stone and ambition, but as a ghost in his memory, a monument to the man he almost was, and the life he so carelessly threw away for a secret whispered in a storm.